For most of human history, if you wanted to signal that you were wealthy, you ate white bread. White flour meant refined flour, bran and germ removed. The soft, pale endosperm milled fine. The result, a light, mild loaf that cost considerably more than the coarse dark bread most people ate. White bread was what the rich served at their tables. Dark bread was what the poor survived on. The distinction between them was as legible as a coat of arms and considerably more universal, since even people who could not read heraldry could tell white flour from brown. Today, the reversal is complete. White bread, the mass-produced sliced sandwich loaf found in every supermarket, cost less than $2. A sourdough loaf, made from whole grain flour by a baker who tended a wild yeast culture for 48 hours, cost $12. The dense, complicated dark bread is the expensive one now. The wealthy eat it. The poor eat white. This inversion happened over about a century between the 1870s and the 1970s. And it happened so completely that most people alive today have no memory of the arrangement it replaced. This is one of the most complete status inversions in the history of food. Understanding how it happened requires going back 14,000 years to the first time someone left wet grain paste sitting out in the open air for a little too long. What came back was better than what they had started with. Bread is a mistake. The first leavened bread that rises, with the open crumb structure that distinguishes it from a flatbread or a cracker, happened because someone left grain paste in a warm place and forgot about it. Wild yeast, present in the air and on the surface of the grain, colonized the mixture, consumed the sugars, and produced carbon dioxide gas. The gas bubbles were trapped in the gluten network that formed when grain proteins mixed with water. The paste puffed. When baked, it held its shape. Nobody planned any of this. The technology arrived before the theory. The earliest physical evidence of leavened bread comes from the Natufian culture of the Levant, dating to some 14,400 years ago, discovered at the Shubaika 1 site in northeastern Jordan in 2018. The Natufians were semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers who had not fully transitioned to agriculture. They were grinding wild grain, mixing it with water, and baking flatbreads before farming existed as an organized practice. The leavened loaf came later, but the basic act of processing grain into bread was already ancient by the time anyone planted a deliberate field. This established something that surprised archaeologists. Bread predates farming by thousands of years. The causality runs in an unexpected direction. People were already invested in bread making before they developed agriculture to supply the grain for it. This is the same relationship proposed for fermented beverages, the desire for the processed product motivating the agricultural infrastructure rather than the other way around. The first farmers may not have been primarily trying to secure more reliable nutrition. They may have been trying to secure a consistent supply of grain for bread and beer. Both required grain. Both required effort on a scale that only deliberate cultivation could sustain across years and generations. The mechanics of accidental leavening explain why wheat became the dominant bread grain wherever it could be grown. Wheat contains two proteins, glutenin and gliadin, that, when mixed with water and worked, form gluten, an elastic network capable of trapping gas bubbles produced by yeast fermentation. No other cereal grain produces this network with the same consistency. This is why wheat, not rye or barley or oats, became the foundation of bread culture across the Mediterranean world, the Middle East, and eventually most of Europe and the Americas. The accident of leavening could only become a repeatable technology once people had access to wheat specifically. The grass that happened to contain the right proteins became the most cultivated plant in human history. Egypt built the first industrial bread production system in human history. The workers who built the pyramids were fed from government bakeries that operated at scales not seen again until the 19th century. At the Giza Plateau, archaeologists have excavated a bakery complex capable of producing tens of thousands of loaves per day. Ceramic bread molds stacked by the thousands, bread-making residue identifiable by chemical analysis, administrative records tracking grain in and bread out with the precision of a modern logistics operation. The pyramid workers were, among other things, bread workers, fed by a supply chain running from Nile Valley grain fields to massive centralized bakeries to the construction site itself. Egyptian bread was not monotonous. Texts from the period identify over 50 distinct varieties, differentiated by grain type, milling fineness, shape, added ingredients, dates, honey, eggs, oil, and intended purpose. There was bread for everyday consumption, bread for ritual offerings, bread for the tomb. The word aish, which Egyptians used for bread, is the same word they used for life. The overlap was not accidental or poetic. Bread was the substance through which biological survival and social existence both operated. An Egyptian who could not access bread could not eat, could not work, and could not participate in the ritual economy that organized their relationship to the divine. Bread was life in a more direct sense than the word carries in any modern context. Egyptian bakers maintained sourdough starters, portions of active fermented dough saved from one batch to seed the next, in the same way that artisan bakers do today. The practice was not understood in microbial terms. Egyptians had no concept of yeast as a living organism. But empirical observation had taught them that keeping a piece of yesterday's dough and adding it to today's produced a consistent, reliable rise, while starting from scratch was unpredictable. The technique encoded knowledge of microbiology without needing the theory. The Egyptians were doing what the best bakers still do 4,500 years later, for the same reasons, without yet knowing why it worked. Egyptian bakers were skilled workers with professional status. Their trade was hereditary in some families, documented in administrative papyri that tracked output and wages with the kind of specificity normally associated with modern payroll systems. The grain they worked with was state-controlled. The bread they produced, a state product, distributed through a state system. The connection between bread production and political authority, which would run through the entire history of Western civilization, was present from the very beginning. When the pharaoh controlled the bakeries, the pharaoh controlled the people who ate from them. The logic was simple and extremely durable. The class marker that persisted for 3,000 years was established early. White bread for the wealthy, dark bread for the poor. The distinction was practical before it became symbolic. White flour required more milling. Bran had to be sifted out multiple times using progressively finer sieves by workers whose labor was expensive. The resulting flour produced less bread per unit of grain than whole grain flour would. White bread cost more to produce and therefore more to buy. Greek symposium culture served white bread alongside its diluted wine. The Latin word for the finest white flour, siligo, appears in Roman texts describing elite consumption in a way that makes clear the color of bread was a legible social marker across the Roman world. A Roman who served dark bread to guests was communicating something about his financial circumstances that no explanation could fully recover. In the Roman system of values, the ability to provide white bread was evidence of prosperity in the same way that the ability to provide a certain wine was. Both were visible consumption of refinement. Both communicated the same message about the host to the guest. I can afford what you cannot. The bread that most people ate was dark, dense, and variable, made from emmer wheat or spelt, or a mixture of grains, milled coarsely and baked in public ovens because most households had no oven of their own. It was heavy enough to be used as a plate. The trencher, the thick slab of stale bread on which meat and vegetables were served at medieval tables, was soaked through with the meal's juices and then eaten afterward by the server or given to the poor. The plate was bread. The distinction between food and food container did not exist in the way it does now, because the resources that would have been required to maintain a separate container were resources that most people did not have. Rome understood the political dimension of bread more explicitly than any civilization before or after. The grain dole, the annona, which Julius Caesar expanded into a system supplying free grain to a large fraction of Rome's urban population, was eventually converted under the empire into a direct bread dole. Citizens received free bread rather than grain they had to mill and bake themselves. This was not generosity, it was infrastructure. A Roman emperor who failed to maintain the bread supply faced riot on a scale that no military force could easily suppress. The phrase bread and circuses, panem et circenses, captures the mechanism precisely. Feed the city, entertain the city, and the city will not overthrow you. Fail at either, and the math changes quickly. Medieval European bread was the most regulated food in history. The Assize of Bread and Ale, enacted in England in 1267, set the price, weight, and quality of bread sold in English markets in direct relation to the current price of wheat. Bakers who produced underweight loaves were fined on first offense. Repeat offenders were dragged through the streets with the deficient loaf tied around their necks, a form of public humiliation that communicated clearly to anyone watching that bread fraud was not a commercial matter, but a social one. The governing class did not regulate bread because it was important to them as a commodity. It regulated bread because it understood what happened when bread was unaffordable or dishonest. The severity of the regulation reflected the severity of the stakes. Bread was not a commodity in medieval England. It was the margin between subsistence and starvation for most of the population. A poor harvest raised wheat prices. Rising wheat prices raised bread prices. Rising bread prices reduced the food available to the poorest households, below the minimum needed to maintain work capacity. The chain ran from weather to wheat to bread to labor to social stability, with a directness that everyone in the system understood. This is why the regulation of bread was a government function rather than a market one. Markets find equilibrium. Starvation is not equilibrium. It is the end of the market. The guild system that organized bread production in medieval European cities gave bakers a protected monopoly in exchange for submission to quality controls and price regulation. A baker in Paris or London who wanted to sell bread had to be a guild member. Guild membership required apprenticeship, examination, and acceptance by existing members. This made bread production both more reliable and more political than any other food trade. When bakers raised prices in defiance of regulated rates, or skimped on quality to maintain margins during expensive wheat years, the response was not economic adjustment, it was riot. Bread riots are the most common form of popular uprising in pre-industrial European history, more frequent than political rebellions, more sustained than religious revolts, more reliably triggered. The people rioted when the bread was bad or unaffordable. And the bread was bad or unaffordable every time the harvest failed and every time a baker decided to exploit the situation. The language of bread runs through medieval and early modern political thought in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct because the language has become metaphorical where it was once literal. When the Lord's Prayer asks for daily bread, the original petition was specific and urgent. Give us enough to eat today, because we are not confident we will have it. The metaphorical reading, give us spiritual sustenance, came later, when bread became abundant enough that its scarcity was no longer the constant background of daily life. Before that, the prayer was a practical request from people who understood that tomorrow was not guaranteed. The technology that inverted the status hierarchy of bread arrived in the second half of the 19th century, the steel roller mill. Traditional millstones ground grain between two flat surfaces, which broke the bran and germ and distributed them unevenly through the flour. Separating white flour from whole grain required multiple passes and siftings, expensive enough that genuinely fine white flour remained a luxury product. Steel roller mills, introduced commercially in the 1870s and 1880s, separated the three components of the wheat kernel, bran, germ, and endosperm, cleanly and at dramatically lower cost. By 1900, white flour was cheap enough that white bread was accessible to working-class consumers across Europe and North America, who had previously eaten dark bread by economic necessity. The change was rapid, and from the perspective of the people experiencing it, unambiguously positive. Nobody mourned the dark loaf. It was associated with poverty and constraint. White bread was what the wealthy had always eaten, and aspiring to eat like the wealthy is a durable human impulse. The population that had eaten dark bread because it was all they could afford switched to white bread as soon as economic conditions allowed. Contemporary observers noted the speed of the shift with some surprise. Working-class families who had eaten brown bread for generations had switched to white within a decade of white becoming affordable. The dark loaf was abandoned without ceremony. What was lost in this transition became clear only later. Most of the fiber, the B vitamins, the minerals, and the complex flavor compounds in wheat are concentrated in the bran and germ that the roller mill was designed to remove. By the early 20th century, pellagra and beriberi, deficiency diseases caused by diets stripped of the B vitamins that whole grains contain, were significant public health problems in populations that had recently switched to refined grain diets. The response was fortification, adding synthetic vitamins back to the white flour from which natural vitamins had just been removed. This remains standard practice today. The white bread in a contemporary supermarket is enriched with iron, folic acid, and multiple B vitamins because the milling process removed them. The enrichment restores roughly what the milling took away, in a form that may or may not behave identically to the natural compounds in a complex biological system. The experiment has been running for 100 years. The results are still being interpreted. The nutritional story of white bread is, in miniature, the story of industrial food in general. A natural product is processed in ways that make it more convenient and more uniform. The processing removes nutritional value. Synthetic versions of that value are added back at additional cost. The resulting product is broadly similar to the original in some respects, and different in ways that are not fully understood in others. The difference matters more or less depending on the particular compound, the particular person, and the particular context. The bread costs more to produce than it would if it had simply never been processed in the first place. This is the economics of convenience. The Chorleywood bread process, developed by the British Baking Industries Research Association in 1961, changed what bread was more completely than any technology since the steel roller mill. The process used high-speed mechanical kneading, mixing at roughly 10 times the speed of traditional mixing, to develop gluten structure in a fraction of the time that fermentation requires. A standard leavened loaf went from needing 24 hours of fermentation and development to needing about 3.5 hours from mixing to baked loaf. Today, the Chorleywood process produces around 80% of the bread sold in the United Kingdom. Most people who have eaten British bread in the past 40 years have eaten it. The process made bread faster, cheaper, and more uniform. It also made possible the use of lower-quality wheat, the softer, lower-protein varieties that grow well in the British climate and that traditional bread making could not work with effectively. Chorleywood bread does not need strong wheat. It needs additives. In addition to flour, water, yeast, and salt, a typical mass-produced British sandwich loaf contains ascorbic acid, emulsifiers, soya flour, and vegetable oil, each serving a specific function in making the bread fast, soft, and shelf-stable. A Chorleywood loaf will stay soft on the shelf for a week. A sourdough loaf made over 24 to 36 hours of natural fermentation will begin to stale within 2 or 3 days. The industrial loaf uses chemistry to simulate the shelf-stable properties that a longer ferment would produce naturally, but without the flavor, the texture, or the biological complexity that the longer ferment actually creates. In the United States, Otto Frederick Rohwedder had invented sliced bread in 1928. solving the problem that pre-slicing a loaf accelerated its staling by simultaneously wrapping it in waxed paper to prevent moisture loss. Wonder Bread adopted the technology immediately. Within a decade, pre-sliced bread had become the default American bread format for most households. The phrase, "the greatest thing since sliced bread," reflects the genuine enthusiasm with which consumers received a product that was, above all, convenient. Uniform slices, soft texture, long shelf life, no knife required. Nobody asked what had been done to the bread to make all of that possible. That conversation came later, and it came slowly. The Sourdough Revival that began in earnest in San Francisco in the 1980s and accelerated globally after 2010 is, on the surface, a story about artisanal food culture and middle-class taste preferences. Underneath, it is a story about what industrial bread took away and what people are willing to pay to get back. The two stories are not in conflict. Both are true simultaneously. Sourdough bread, made with a starter culture of wild yeast and bacteria rather than commercial baker's yeast, fermented slowly over 12 to 48 hours, is chemically distinct from industrial bread in ways that matter nutritionally. The long fermentation produces organic acids that break down phytic acid in the flour. Phytic acid normally binds to minerals and prevents their absorption in the gut. In a sourdough loaf, the minerals become bioavailable. The fermentation also partially pre-digests the starches, reducing the rate at which blood sugar rises after eating, a difference that has been measured in clinical studies and is large enough to be meaningful for people managing blood sugar levels. The bacteria in the starter culture, primarily Lactobacillus species, produce compounds that appear to affect gut microbiome composition in ways that fast-fermented bread does not. None of this was understood when the first sourdough was baked 10,000 years ago. The intuition that long-fermented bread was the right bread came before the science by several millennia. The flavor compounds produced by sourdough fermentation number in the hundreds, compared to the relatively few generated by the fast fermentation of industrial bread. These compounds interact during the baking process to produce the complex, slightly sour, deeply wheaten flavor that distinguishes sourdough and that industrial bread cannot replicate with any combination of additives. The person paying $12 for a sourdough loaf is paying for 48 hours of a baker's time and for a process requiring genuine skill rather than a machine mixing dough at high speed. The product is biologically different from the one sold for $2 at the supermarket. Whether that difference justifies a six-fold price premium is a question about values, but the difference is real and it is measurable. The sourdough starter in a contemporary bakery is a culture of wild yeast and bacteria maintained through continuous feeding. A portion of flour and water is added every day, the old culture partly discarded, the new culture fed and allowed to develop. This is exactly the process the Egyptian bakers were using at Giza 4,500 years ago. The revival is not the invention of something new. It is the recovery of something very old that was abandoned in the pursuit of speed and uniformity by an industry that understood efficiency but not what it was losing. The oldest baking technology in the world is now the most fashionable. The wheel has turned completely, and it turned on the same axis it always turns on. Whatever the poor once had, the wealthy eventually want. The loaf of bread is the oldest manufactured food product in human history. It predates writing, it predates money, it predates most of the institutions and technologies we associate with civilization. At its most fundamental, bread is the result of a human decision to take something the natural world offered, a grass seed, and transform it into something the natural world would never produce on its own. The decision was simple. The consequences were not. That decision, made in various forms by various peoples between 14,000 and 10,000 years ago, is the foundation of every city, every empire, every tax system, every price riot, and every social contract in the history of Western civilization. The class reversal that opened this story is not a historical curiosity. It is a pattern that runs through the history of food. The food of the wealthy becomes the food of the masses when technology makes it cheap. The food of the masses becomes the food of the wealthy when scarcity or craft makes it expensive again. Spices followed this pattern. Sugar followed it. Coffee followed it. White bread followed it, and has now been followed by its own reversal. What changes is not the food, but the context of its production. Who makes it, how long it takes, what is added and removed, and what the person eating it says about themselves by choosing it. The wheat is the same. The yeast is the same. The water is the same. The difference between a Chorleywood sliced loaf and a 48-hour sourdough is a difference of time, attention, and process, and that difference costs $10. A Natufian woman grinding wild grain at Shubaika 14,000 years ago would have understood the sourdough baker in ways she would not understand almost anything else about the present. The knowledge of how to turn a grass seed into a living culture and then into a risen loaf has passed through every civilization that used it, essentially unchanged, across the longest unbroken chain of transmitted practice in human history. The bread does not know this. It never did. The knowledge is ours, and we have always used it to say something about ourselves that goes well beyond what we are eating.